The first sound Raina remembered was iron, not words, not her mother's voice, just the scraping clink of metal against metal, a dull echo rolling through the damp dark of a slave ship's hold and lodging itself somewhere deep behind her breastbone, where fear and memory learned to share the same space. Years later, in the suffocating heat of a Carolina summer, that sound would return to her in the most unlikely of places, the polished drawing room of a white woman's house, where iron lay hidden beneath velvet and lace, waiting to taste skin again. If stories like this move you, pause for a second, hit the like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter we tell, and let a comment down below saying where in the world you're watching from right now. On the day Raina stepped onto Carolina soil, the sky was the same color as old bruises, yellowed clouds pressed low, promising storms that never quite broke. She did not know whether she stood in North Carolina or South Carolina. All she knew was that the air tasted heavy and sweet, thick with the smell of pine sap and rotting vegetation. Her wrists ached beneath rusted shackles, her ankles raw where iron cuffs had bitten through skin on the long march from the harbor. Around her, a line of black bodies shuffled forward in silence, chains clinking in a rhythm that made her teeth hurt. Ahead loomed a courtyard, crowded with white faces and restless horses. Beyond that, a big house with white columns and a wide porch sprawled like a smug, lazy beast across a rise of ground. Fields stretched behind it in every direction, rows and rows of cotton plants reaching up like pale, desperate hands. Somewhere a dog barked, sharp and insistent. Somewhere a child laughed. The sounds rolled together into a nightmarish tableau that would define the rest of her life. "Keep your eyes down," hissed the man beside her in the line, his accent tinged with the Caribbean, his voice barely louder than breath. "They don't like it when we look." Raina lowered her gaze to the packed red earth, but not before catching a glimpse of her reflection in a shallow puddle by the steps. A thin girl stared back at her, no more than 17, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much ocean and too many goodbyes. Her hair, once braided with care by her mother's fingers, hung in tangled coils around her face. The iron at her wrists gleamed dull and dark against her skin. A voice rang out from the porch, sharp as a whip crack. "Bring that one here." The words were directed at the trader, but Raina felt them strike her own body. Big hands closed around her shoulders and shoved her forward out of the line, up the 3 steps that creaked under her weight. She stumbled, her knees banging against the wood, and for a heartbeat she smelled something familiar, soap and boiled starch and the faint citrus tang of lemon oil. The smell of a house, not a ship, not a pen, not the open road. Then she saw her. The white woman stood in the doorway, framed by shadows and lace curtains, a silver fan dangling from one gloved hand. She wore a dress the color of storm clouds, cinched brutally tight at the waist, her pale neck wrapped in a string of pearls that glistened obscenely in the dim light. Her hair was piled high beneath a small hat, veiled with black netting, but her eyes, cold, pale blue, like shards of broken glass, missed nothing. "Turn her," the woman said, and the trader obeyed, spinning Raina around as if she were a piece of livestock. Fingers pried at her lips, pinched at the muscles in her arms, tapped at her ribs. Someone yanked up her skirt to check her legs for scars. The woman watched with clinical detachment, her gaze moving over Raina's body the way someone might appraise a horse. When the inspection was done, she flicked her fan open with a little snap. "This one," she said. "She will do for the house. I lost a girl last month. Stupid thing put her hand in the wrong place and the boiling water took her skin clean off. I need new hands. She looks strong enough." The trader named a price. There was haggling, numbers tossed back and forth like stones. Raina stared down at her bare feet, digging her toes into the splinters of the porch, and felt herself become a calculation in the air. When the deal was struck, the woman stepped closer. The fragrance of her perfume, lavender and something powdery, almost chokingly sweet, filled Raina's nose. "You answer to me now," the woman said quietly, her voice low enough that only Raina could hear. "My name is Mrs. Caldwell. You will learn it. You will learn every corner of this house, every chore, every rule. You will learn quickly or you will suffer. Do you understand?" Raina swallowed. The iron at her wrists seemed heavier than before. "Yes, Mrs.," she whispered, the words foreign on her tongue. Mrs. Caldwell's lips curved. It was not a smile. "Good. Take those shackles off her. She won't run. There is nowhere to go." Raina watched as the overseer stepped forward with a key. The click of the lock was strangely loud. The iron band fell away from her skin and, for a moment, she felt naked without its weight. The cuff had left a dark, abraded ring around each wrist, faintly swollen, the skin torn in places where metal had rubbed raw. Mrs. Caldwell's gaze dropped and lingered on those marks. "Unsightly," she murmured, "but they will fade. Most things do." Raina lifted her wrist slightly, feeling the air on the raw flesh. There was a sting, a phantom pressure where the metal had been. She did not know yet that those bruised circles would never truly disappear, that the skin would always carry a faint shadow of iron. She did not know that years later, her hands would remember the exact weight of a shackle, the way a snake remembers the shape of its own coil. All she knew was that her world had narrowed to the white woman's voice and the ache in her arms. "Bring her inside," Mrs. Caldwell said. "There is much to do." Inside, the house swallowed her whole. The air was cooler than outside, the thick walls trapping shadows and the smell of polish. Raina's bare feet sank into rugs, softer than anything she had felt before, and the sensation made her dizzy. How could softness exist in a place that owned chains? Candles burned in glass lamps along the walls, their light glancing off framed paintings of long-dead white men in stiff collars. A grandfather clock ticked solemnly in the hallway, marking out time that did not belong to her. She was led through a maze of rooms, dining rooms with long tables set for meals that would never feed her, parlors with velvet settees arranged around cold fireplaces, bedrooms with canopy beds draped in mosquito netting. Each space felt like a separate world, sealed off from the next by heavy doors and thick curtains. The house smelled of beeswax and tobacco, and something faintly rotten like fruit left too long in a bowl. At the back of the house, near the kitchen, Mrs. Caldwell stopped. She gestured to a narrow hallway that branched off toward what looked like storage rooms. "That is where you will sleep," she said, "with the other house girls. You will rise before dawn. You will light the fires, prepare the water, set the table for breakfast. You will serve meals, clean chambers, wash linens, polish silver. You will move quietly. You will speak only when spoken to. You will never, ever look me in the eye. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mrs." "Good." Mrs. Caldwell turned on her heel and walked away, her skirts rustling like dry leaves. "Bess will show you what to do. Don't make me regret buying you." The sound of her footsteps faded down the hall, and Raina was left standing alone in the dim corridor. A moment later, a door creaked open and an older black woman emerged, her face lined with exhaustion and something harder. Resignation, maybe, or a kind of numb endurance. She wore a plain cotton dress and a head wrap knotted tightly around her graying hair. "You the new girl?" the woman asked, her voice flat. Raina nodded. "I'm Bess. Come on then. I'll show you where you sleep and what needs doing. Keep your head down and your mouth shut and you might last longer than the last one." Raina followed her down the narrow hallway to a small room barely wider than a closet. 2 pallets lay on the floor, thin and stained, covered with rough woolen blankets. A single candle stub sat on an upturned crate between them. The walls were bare wood, and the air smelled of mildew and sweat. "That one's yours," Bess said, nodding to the pallet nearest the door. "We wake when the rooster crows. Sometimes earlier if Mrs. Caldwell has guests. You'll learn the routine quick enough." Raina set her bundle down, a scrap of cloth containing nothing but a broken comb and a piece of string, and sank onto the pallet. The straw inside crackled under her weight. Her wrists throbbed where the iron had been, and she rubbed them absently, feeling the ridges of torn skin. Bess watched her for a moment, then sat down heavily on her own pallet. "You got a name?" "Raina." "Where you from?" "I don't know anymore." Bess nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. "Well, Raina, let me tell you something. Mrs. Caldwell, she's the worst kind. She don't scream and holler like some of them do. She's quiet, cold. She'll smile at you while she orders the overseer to beat you half to death. She'll say please and thank you, and then turn around and sell your baby south without blinking. You understand what I'm telling you?" Raina understood. She had seen cruelty before, on the ship, in the pens, in the faces of men who bought and sold human flesh. But there was something about the way Bess spoke that made her stomach tighten. "How long you been here?" Raina asked. 10 years, maybe more. I lost count. 10 years. The number sat between them like a stone. "You ever think about running?" Raina whispered. Bess's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something old and buried. "Every day," she said quietly, "but thinking and doing are 2 different things. You run, they catch you, and when they catch you, they make sure you never run again. You seen those dogs out there? They got a taste for black skin. And the patrollers, white men who ride at night looking for runaways, they're worse than the dogs." Raina said nothing. She thought about the iron that had circled her wrists, the way it had felt like a living thing, tightening with every breath. She thought about the woman with the cold blue eyes and the voice like silk over steel. "Get some sleep," Bess said, blowing out the candle. "Tomorrow comes early." In the darkness, Raina lay on her back and stared at the ceiling she couldn't see. The house creaked and settled around her, a living thing full of ghosts. She touched her wrists again, tracing the raw circles where the shackles had been. The skin was hot and tender, and she wondered if it would scar. She didn't know yet that it would. She didn't know that those scars would become a map she would carry for the rest of her life, a reminder of where she had been and what she had survived. She didn't know that one day she would press those same iron cuffs against someone else's skin, and that the sound of metal clicking shut would be the sweetest sound she had ever heard. All she knew in that moment was that she was tired. Tired in a way that sleep could not cure. Tired in her bones, in her blood, in the hollow place where hope used to live. But somewhere, deep beneath the exhaustion, a small flame still flickered. It was rage, quiet and patient, waiting for its moment. The days blurred together in a haze of work and pain. Raina learned the rhythm of the house quickly, driven by Bess's sharp whispers and the ever-present threat of Mrs. Caldwell's displeasure. She rose before dawn, her body stiff and aching, and stumbled through the dark to the kitchen, where the fire had to be lit and the water had to be boiled. Her hands, still raw from the shackles, cracked and bled in the cold water she used to scrub floors and wash dishes. Mrs. Caldwell's voice followed her everywhere, a constant presence even when the woman herself was not in the room. "The silver is tarnished. Do it again. You call this clean? I can see dust on the mantel. Move faster. You're wasting time." Raina learned to move like a ghost, silent and invisible, slipping through rooms without making a sound. She learned to anticipate Mrs. Caldwell's needs before they were spoken, to read the tightening of her lips or the flick of her fan as signals of displeasure. She learned that mistakes were punished swiftly and without mercy. The first time she dropped a plate, Mrs. Caldwell didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Raina with those cold blue eyes and said, "Come here." Raina's heart hammered in her chest as she approached. Mrs. Caldwell held out her hand, palm up, and in it lay a thin leather strap. "Hold out your hands," Mrs. Caldwell said softly. Raina obeyed, her wrists still tender and scarred. The strap came down across her palms once, twice, 3 times, each strike precise and measured. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Raina didn't cry out. She bit down on her tongue until she tasted blood and kept her eyes fixed on the floor. When it was over, Mrs. Caldwell handed the strap to Bess, who stood nearby with her face carefully blank. "Clean up the broken plate," Mrs. Caldwell said, "and make sure she understands that carelessness has consequences." Raina's hand shook as she gathered the shards of porcelain, her palms burning where the strap had landed. That night, Bess wrapped her hands in strips of cloth soaked in cold water, her movements gentle but her expression hard. "You got to be more careful," Bess said. "She's watching you. She's always watching." Raina nodded, but she didn't speak. She was learning that words were dangerous in this house, that silence was safer than speech. The weeks turned into months, and Raina's body adapted to the brutal routine. Her hands grew calloused. Her back grew stronger. Her feet grew numb to the cold floors. But her mind stayed sharp, cataloguing every detail of the house, every door and window, every corner where shadows gathered. She watched the patterns of the household, when the overseer made his rounds, when the other enslaved people came and went, when Mrs. Caldwell retired to her chambers, and when she entertained guests in the parlor. She also watched Mrs. Caldwell herself, studying the woman the way a mouse studies a cat. She noticed the way Mrs. Caldwell's mood shifted with the weather, how she was sweetest on sunny days and cruelest when storms threatened. She noticed the way the woman touched her pearls when she was pleased, the way she tapped her fan when she was annoyed. She noticed the keys that hung from Mrs. Caldwell's belt, a heavy ring of iron that jangled softly whenever she moved. One of those keys, Raina learned, unlocked the small room off the kitchen where supplies were kept. Another unlocked the cellar where wine and preserves were stored. But there was one key, smaller than the rest, that unlocked a drawer in Mrs. Caldwell's writing desk. Raina had seen her open it once when she thought no one was watching, and pull out a small velvet pouch. Inside that pouch, Raina glimpsed something that made her breath catch, a pair of iron cuffs, smaller and more delicate than the ones that had been on her wrists, but unmistakably shackles. They were polished to a dull shine, and a length of chain connected them, each link no thicker than a finger. Mrs. Caldwell had held them up to the light, turning them this way and that, a strange smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Then she had tucked them back into the pouch and locked the drawer again. Raina never forgot that moment. The sight of those shackles hidden away like a secret treasure lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave. She wondered who they had belonged to, what story they carried. She wondered why Mrs. Caldwell kept them locked in a drawer instead of hanging them on a wall or storing them in the cellar with the other tools of bondage. But she didn't ask. She kept her silence and her watchfulness, and she waited. Winter came, bringing with it cold winds that rattled the windows and froze the water in the wash basins. Raina's hands cracked and bled again, the old scars on her wrists aching in the cold. Mrs. Caldwell grew more demanding, her temper shorter, her punishments more frequent. Bess moved through the days like a woman underwater, her face expressionless, her eyes distant. One night, after a particularly brutal day, Raina lay on her pallet and whispered into the darkness, "Bess, you awake?" There was a long silence, and then Bess's voice came back, low and weary. "What is it? You ever see Mrs. Caldwell with iron cuffs? Small ones on a chain." Bess was quiet for so long that Raina thought she had fallen asleep, but then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Yeah, I seen them." Where'd they come from? They was her mother's. Old Mrs. Caldwell, before she died. She used to keep them on the mantel in her bedroom like some kind of decoration. When she passed, Mrs. Caldwell took them and locked them away. Why? I don't know. Maybe she don't want folks asking questions. Maybe she likes having secrets. Bess paused. "Why are you asking?" Raina didn't answer. She stared up at the ceiling and thought about iron and secrets and the way cruelty could be passed down like an heirloom. The cold deepened, and with it came illness. One of the field hands fell sick with fever and was carried to the cabin behind the big house, where he died 3 days later. Another girl, younger than Raina, collapsed while carrying water and was sold south before the week was out. Mrs. Caldwell watched it all with the same cool detachment, as if death and suffering were no more remarkable than the changing of the seasons. Raina felt the rage inside her growing, feeding on every humiliation, every punishment, every cold glance from those pale blue eyes. It was a living thing now, coiled tight in her chest, waiting for the moment when it could unfurl and strike. That moment came on a February morning, when the sky was white with frost and the air smelled like snow. Raina was in the parlor, polishing the silver candlesticks, when she heard Mrs. Caldwell's voice in the hallway. She was speaking to someone, a man by the sound of it, and her tone was light, almost playful. "Yes, I do believe she'll fetch a good price," Mrs. Caldwell was saying. "She's young, healthy, good with her hands. A bit sullen, perhaps, but nothing a firm hand can't correct." Raina's fingers stilled on the candlestick. "She's talking about me," she thought. "She's selling me." The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. After all these months, after everything she had endured, she was going to be sold again, passed from one pair of white hands to another like a piece of furniture. The rage inside her flared, white-hot and blinding. Her hands trembled as she set down the candlestick and stood, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She walked to the doorway and looked into the hallway. Mrs. Caldwell stood there with a man Raina didn't recognize, a trader by the look of him, with a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. They were discussing terms, numbers, logistics, as if Raina were nothing more than a transaction to be completed. Mrs. Caldwell glanced up and saw her standing there. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "Raina," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Come here." Raina walked forward on legs that felt like wood. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "This is Mr. Hawthorne," Mrs. Caldwell said. "He'll be taking you to Wilmington next week. You're to go with him without any fuss. Do you understand?" Raina didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, trapped behind the roar of blood in her ears. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "I asked you a question." Raina lifted her head and looked Mrs. Caldwell in the eye for the first time since she had arrived. The woman's expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "No," Raina said. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and defiant. Mrs. Caldwell's face went very still. "What did you say?" "I said no." The trader took a step back, sensing danger. Mrs. Caldwell's hand moved to the keys at her belt, her fingers closing around them like a weapon. "You will do as you are told," she said, her voice low and venomous, "or you will suffer consequences you cannot imagine." Raina felt something break loose inside her, something that had been held down for too long. "I've already suffered," she said, "and I'm done." Mrs. Caldwell moved faster than Raina expected. Her hand shot out and caught Raina across the face, the slap echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. Raina's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning, but she didn't fall. She stood her ground, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her eyes locked on the white woman's face. "How dare you?" Mrs. Caldwell hissed. "How dare you speak to me that way?" The trader cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ma'am, perhaps we should get out." Mrs. Caldwell snapped, not taking her eyes off Raina. "I will deal with this myself." The man hesitated, then nodded and backed toward the door. Raina heard it close behind him, the sound final as a coffin lid. She was alone with Mrs. Caldwell now, alone in the parlor where sunlight streamed through lace curtains and made patterns on the polished floor. Mrs. Caldwell's breathing was rapid, her chest rising and falling beneath the tight bodice of her dress. Her hand moved to the keys at her belt again, and this time she unhooked the ring and held it in her palm, the metal glinting in the light. "You think you can defy me?" she said softly. "You think you have any power here? You are nothing. You are property. You exist because I allow you to exist." Raina felt the rage burning hotter, consuming the fear that tried to rise up and choke it. "I'm a person," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "I have a name. I had a mother. I had a life before you bought me like a piece of meat." Mrs. Caldwell's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Had," she repeated. "Past tense. Whatever you were before doesn't matter now. All that matters is what I make of you." She turned and walked to her writing desk, unlocking the small drawer with one of the keys. Raina watched as she pulled out the velvet pouch she had seen months ago, the one that held the iron cuffs. Mrs. Caldwell opened the pouch and let the shackles slide out onto the desk, the chain clinking softly. "My mother used these on a girl who tried to run," Mrs. Caldwell said, running her fingers over the metal. "She caught her 3 miles from the property line and brought her back. She put these on her wrists and made her wear them for a month. Every day, every night, those cuffs stayed on. The girl never tried to run again." Raina's eyes fixed on the shackles. They were smaller than the ones she had worn on the ship, more delicate, but no less cruel. The cuffs were lined with rough iron that would bite into skin with every movement, and the chain was just long enough to allow the hands to move, but not to forget they were bound. "That girl learned her place," Mrs. Caldwell continued, "and so will you." She picked up the shackles and walked toward Raina, holding them out like an offering. "Hold out your wrists." Raina didn't move. Her hands stayed at her sides, clenched into fists. The scars on her wrists throbbed, as if they could sense what was coming. "I said hold out your wrists." "No." Mrs. Caldwell's face flushed red. She grabbed Raina's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises, and tried to force her wrist up. Raina jerked back, twisting out of her grip, and stumbled against the edge of the desk. The shackles fell from Mrs. Caldwell's hand and clattered to the floor. For a moment, they both stared at the iron cuffs lying between them. Then Mrs. Caldwell lunged for them. But Raina was faster. Her hand closed around the chain, the metal cold and solid in her palm, and she yanked it away. Mrs. Caldwell straightened, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with something that might have been shock or might have been fear. "Give those to me," she said, her voice tight. Raina looked down at the shackles in her hand. The weight of them was familiar, a ghost of every chain she had ever worn. Her fingers tightened around the metal until her knuckles went white. "No," she said again. Mrs. Caldwell took a step forward. "You are making a grave mistake. Put those down, and we can forget this ever happened. I will be lenient. I will—" "Shut up." The words came out low and venomous, and they stopped Mrs. Caldwell mid-sentence. Raina lifted her head and looked the white woman in the eye, really looked at her, and saw something she had never seen before: uncertainty, fear even. The realization sent a thrill through her body, sharp and electric. "You talk, and you talk," Raina said, her voice growing stronger. "You give orders like you're some kind of god, but you're not. You're just a woman who's never felt what it's like to have iron on your skin. You've never felt what it's like to be owned." Mrs. Caldwell's hand moved toward the bell on her desk, the one she used to summon the overseer. But Raina moved faster. She stepped between Mrs. Caldwell and the desk, blocking her path, the shackles still clutched in her hand. "You want to know what it feels like," Raina said. "You want to know what you've been doing to us all these years?" Mrs. Caldwell's eyes widened. "Don't you dare—" Raina grabbed her wrist. The white woman tried to pull away, but Raina's grip was iron. Months of hauling water and scrubbing floors and carrying heavy loads had made her strong, stronger than Mrs. Caldwell, whose hands had never done anything harder than lift a teacup. Raina forced her arm down, bending it at the elbow, and snapped one of the cuffs around her wrist. The click of the lock was the loudest sound Raina had ever heard. Mrs. Caldwell screamed. She jerked her arm back, but the cuff held fast, the iron biting into her pale skin. She stared at her wrist in horror, at the dark metal encircling it, at the chain dangling from it like a leash. "Take it off," she gasped. "Take it off right now." Raina didn't answer. She grabbed Mrs. Caldwell's other wrist, the woman thrashing and clawing at her face, nails raking across Raina's cheek and drawing blood, but Raina barely felt it. She forced the second wrist down and locked the other cuff in place. Mrs. Caldwell stumbled backward, her hands bound together in front of her, the chain swinging between them. She looked down at the shackles as if she couldn't believe they were real, as if they were some kind of hallucination. Then she looked up at Raina, and the expression on her face was pure, unfiltered terror. "You're going to hang for this," she whispered. "They're going to string you up and—" "Maybe," Raina said, "but you're going to feel what I felt first." She grabbed the chain and pulled, yanking Mrs. Caldwell forward. The woman stumbled, her feet tangling in her skirts, and fell to her knees on the polished floor. The sound of her knees hitting the wood was sharp and satisfying. "Get up," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice shaking. "Get—" Raina pulled the chain again, harder this time, and Mrs. Caldwell sprawled forward, catching herself on her bound hands. The iron cuffs scraped against the floor, and the woman let out a choked sob. "How does it feel?" Raina asked, her voice cold and steady. "How does it feel to have metal on your wrists? To know you can't get free?" Mrs. Caldwell didn't answer. She was breathing in short, panicked gasps, her face flushed and streaked with tears. Raina had never seen her cry before. She had never seen her anything but composed, controlled, untouchable. Now she looked small and breakable, a porcelain doll shattered on the floor. Raina crouched down beside her, still holding the chain. "Every day you put your hands on me," she said. "Every day you made me feel like I was nothing. You and women like you think you own us. You think you can do whatever you want because we can't fight back." She leaned in closer, her face inches from Mrs. Caldwell's. "But I'm fighting back now." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes were wild, darting toward the door, toward the windows, searching for escape. "Someone will come," she gasped. "Bess, the overseer, someone will—" "No one's coming," Raina said. "Bess is in the kitchen. The overseer's out in the fields. And even if they weren't, do you think they'd help you? Do you think they'd risk themselves for you?" The truth of it settled over Mrs. Caldwell's face like a shroud. She was alone. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone and powerless. Raina stood, still holding the chain, and pulled Mrs. Caldwell to her feet. The woman swayed, her legs unsteady, her bound hands clutched against her chest. The shackles had already left red marks on her wrists, the skin abraded where the rough iron rubbed. "Please," Mrs. Caldwell whispered. "Please, I'll let you go. I'll give you money. I'll write you free papers. Just take these off." Raina felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. "You think I believe you? You think I'd trust anything you say? I mean it, I swear You swore to feed us and you starved us. You swore to treat us fairly and you beat us. Your words don't mean anything." Mrs. Caldwell's face crumpled. She sank back down to her knees, her shoulders shaking. "What are you going to do to me?" Raina looked down at her, at this woman who had held her life in her hands like it was worthless. She thought about all the things she could do. She thought about dragging her through the house, making her scrub floors with her wrists bound, making her feel every humiliation Raina had endured. She thought about calling the other enslaved people in and letting them see their mistress brought low. But then she looked at the shackles on Mrs. Caldwell's wrists, at the way the woman's hands trembled, at the red marks already forming on her skin, and she realized something. It wasn't enough. No amount of suffering she could inflict would balance the scales. No punishment would undo what had been done. The only thing that mattered now was getting out. Raina released the chain and stepped back. Mrs. Caldwell looked up at her, confusion and hope flickering across her tear-streaked face. "I'm leaving," Raina said, "and you're not going to stop me." "The shackles. You'll figure it out, or you won't. I don't care." Raina turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Caldwell struggling to her feet, the chain clinking as she moved. "Wait!" the woman called out, her voice high and desperate. "You can't just leave me like this. Someone will find me. They'll know what you did. They'll hunt you down." Raina paused in the doorway and looked back. Mrs. Caldwell stood in the middle of the parlor, her hands bound, her dress disheveled, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "Let them hunt," Raina said. "I've been hunted my whole life. I know how to run." She walked out of the parlor and down the hallway, her footsteps steady and sure. Behind her she heard Mrs. Caldwell's voice rising in panic, calling for help, for Bess, for anyone. But Raina didn't stop. She walked through the kitchen, past the startled face of another housegirl, and out the back door into the cold February air. The sky was still white with frost, the ground hard and frozen beneath her bare feet. She had no coat, no food, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the big house. But as she crossed the yard and slipped into the trees at the edge of the property, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: freedom. It was fragile and uncertain, a flame that could be snuffed out at any moment, but it was hers, and she would fight to keep it. The cold hit her like a fist. Raina's thin cotton dress offered no protection against the wind that cut through the trees, sharp as broken glass. Her bare feet crunched over frozen leaves and patches of ice, each step sending jolts of pain up her legs. She had no sense of direction, no map in her mind except the urgent pull away from the house, away from Mrs. Caldwell's voice still ringing in her ears. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. Then she slowed to a fast walk, weaving between pine trees and scrub oak. The forest was dense here, the undergrowth thick with briars that tore at her dress and scratched her arms. She pushed through anyway, ignoring the sting. Her mind focused on a single thought: distance. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Raina had no idea how far she had traveled. Her feet were numb, bleeding from a dozen cuts she couldn't feel. Her hands trembled from cold and exhaustion, but she kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death, or worse. As darkness fell, she found a hollow beneath an old oak tree, its roots creating a small, sheltered space. She crawled inside and curled into a ball, trying to preserve what little warmth her body still held. The forest around her came alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush, the distant howl of what might have been a dog, or might have been something worse. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell, probably still wearing those shackles, screaming for help that would come too late to stop Raina's escape. She thought about Bess, wondering if the older woman would be punished for Raina's actions, if Mrs. Caldwell would take her rage out on whoever was closest. The guilt tried to take root, but Raina pushed it away. She couldn't afford guilt now. She couldn't afford anything but survival. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by cold and fear. Every sound made her jolt awake, certain she heard dogs or men on horses. But morning came eventually, grey and bitter, and Raina crawled out of her hiding place with joints so stiff she could barely stand. She needed water, food, shelter. She needed help. The word lodged in her throat like a stone. Help meant trusting someone, and trust was a luxury enslaved people couldn't afford. But she also knew she wouldn't last long alone in the woods, with winter still gripping the land. She had heard whispers in the quarters back at the Caldwell place, stories told in low voices after the overseer had made his rounds. Stories about people who helped runaways, about safe houses and secret routes north, about something called the Underground Railroad. Raina didn't know if the stories were true or just desperate fantasies, but she had nothing else. She walked through the morning, following what looked like an old deer trail, her feet leaving bloody prints in patches of snow. The sun climbed higher, but offered little warmth. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a gnawing ache that made her dizzy. She tried chewing on pine needles the way she had seen someone do once, but they only made her mouth taste like turpentine and did nothing for the hunger. By midday, she heard the sound of water. She stumbled toward it, pushing through a thicket of brambles, and found a narrow creek running fast and dark between its banks. She dropped to her knees and cupped her hands, drinking until her stomach felt tight and heavy. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it was the best thing she had tasted in days. She washed her feet in the creek, wincing as the icy water stung her cuts. Then she sat back on the muddy bank and tried to think. She needed to move north. That much she knew from the whispered stories. North meant freedom, meant states where slavery was illegal, meant the possibility of a life that belonged to her. But north was hundreds of miles away, through territory crawling with patrollers and slave catchers and dogs trained to hunt human scent. The sound of a branch snapping made her freeze. She turned slowly, her heart hammering, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. A black man, older, with graying hair and a face carved with deep lines. He wore rough work clothes and carried a walking stick, and his eyes were sharp and assessing. They stared at each other for a long moment. Raina's muscles tensed, ready to run, but something in the man's expression stopped her. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he had been searching for something and had just found it. "You running?" he asked quietly. Raina didn't answer. The question could be a trap. He could be owned by someone nearby, sent to look for runaways. He could be anything. The man seemed to understand her silence. He glanced around, checking the trees, then looked back at her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, "and I'm not going to turn you in. But you need to get off this trail. Patrollers come through here sometimes." "Who are you?" Raina managed to whisper. "Name's Josiah. I'm free. Got my papers and everything, though that don't always matter much around here." He took a step closer, moving slowly as if approaching a wild animal. "You from the Caldwell place?" Raina's breath caught. How did he know? Josiah saw the question in her face. "Word travels fast. They're already looking for you. Whole county knows about the girl who put shackles on her mistress and ran." Raina felt ice in her veins. "How long ago?" "Riders came through the settlement where I live last night, offering a reward." He paused. "They say Mrs. Caldwell was found by her overseer, still wearing those cuffs. Took them 2 hours to get them off. She's madder than a hornet, and twice as mean." Raina's hands clenched into fists. Part of her felt a savage satisfaction at the image of Mrs. Caldwell trapped in iron, helpless and humiliated. But the larger part knew what this meant. They would never stop looking for her. She had done the unthinkable. She had struck back. "You need to come with me," Josiah said. "There are people who can help you, but we need to move now." "Why would you help me?" "Because I was where you are once. Because I know what it costs to run. Because if I don't help, who will?" He held out his hand. "We don't have time for long conversations, girl." "You coming or not?" Raina looked at his hand, weathered and calloused, offered in the grey morning light. Every instinct screamed at her not to trust anyone, but those same instincts had gotten her this far, and no further. She was cold, hungry, hunted. She needed help whether she wanted to admit it or not. She took his hand. Josiah pulled her to her feet and immediately started walking, moving fast through the trees. Raina followed, her feet protesting every step. He led her away from the creek, deeper into the forest, along paths only he seemed to see. They walked for what felt like hours, Josiah occasionally pausing to listen or check their surroundings. Finally, as the sun began its descent again, they emerged into a small clearing. A cabin stood in the center, rough-built but solid, smoke rising from a chimney. Josiah approached the door and knocked 3 times, then twice, then once. The door opened to reveal a black woman, middle-aged, with intelligent eyes and hands stained with what looked like indigo dye. She took one look at Raina and stepped aside. "Get her inside," she said. "Quick." Raina stumbled into the cabin, and the door closed behind her with a soft thud. The warmth hit her immediately, and she swayed on her feet. The woman caught her arm and guided her to a chair by the fire. "Sit down before you fall down," the woman said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Josiah, get her some water, and some bread if we have any left." Raina sank into the chair and felt her body begin to shake, not just from cold, but from the sudden release of tension. She was inside. She was warm. For the moment, she was safe. The woman crouched in front of her and began examining her feet, clicking her tongue at the cuts and bruises. "You did a number on yourself," she muttered. "We'll need to clean these up and get you some proper shoes." "Who are you?" Raina whispered. "Name's Hannah. This is my place. Josiah and I, we help people like you." She looked up, meeting Raina's eyes. "People running toward freedom. Is this the Underground Railroad?" Hannah smiled faintly. "That's what some call it. We just call it doing what's right." She stood and moved to a shelf, pulling down a tin container. "Now let me see to those feet. Then we'll get some food in you and figure out the next step." As Hannah worked, cleaning and bandaging Raina's feet with gentle efficiency, Josiah returned with a cup of water and a thick slice of bread. Raina ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp it down, and felt strength beginning to return to her limbs. "They're looking hard for you," Josiah said, settling into a chair across from her. "Harder than usual. What you did to that woman, it scared them bad." "Good," Raina said, and meant it. Hannah glanced up from bandaging. "It's good you fought back, but it also means they'll be watching the usual routes north. We'll need to be careful." "How long before I can move on?" Raina asked. "Few days at least. You need rest and proper food, and we need to wait for word about the patrols." Hannah tied off the bandage and sat back. "You're safe here for now. This cabin's hidden well, and the white folks around here think I'm just a washerwoman who keeps to herself." Raina nodded, exhaustion suddenly crashing over her like a wave. Her eyes felt heavy, and the warmth of the fire was lulling her toward sleep. "There's a bed in the back room," Hannah said, reading her expression. "Go lie down. We'll watch for trouble." Raina wanted to protest, to stay alert, but her body had other ideas. She let Hannah guide her to a small room with a narrow bed covered in quilts. She collapsed onto it and was asleep before Hannah had even closed the door. She woke to darkness and the sound of voices. For a panicked moment, she thought the patrollers had found her, but then she recognized Hannah's voice, low and measured, speaking to someone else. Raina sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching, and crept to the door. In the main room, lit by a single candle, Hannah and Josiah stood with 2 other people, a young black man Raina didn't recognize, and an older white woman with grey hair and a stern face. The white woman's presence made Raina's heart race, but no one seemed alarmed. "The next station is 20 miles north," the white woman was saying. "But the roads are being watched. They've doubled the patrols after what happened at the Caldwell place. We'll have to go through the swamp," Josiah said. "It's harder, but safer." "Can she handle it?" the white woman asked. "She put shackles on her mistress and walked away," Hannah said quietly. "She can handle anything." The white woman nodded slowly. "Very well, I'll have supplies ready. When do you want to move her?" 2 days. Give her time to heal and for things to calm down a bit. If you're following Raina's journey and want to see where it leads, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. The white woman left through a back door that Raina hadn't noticed before, and the young man followed. Hannah turned and saw Raina standing in the doorway. "You're awake," she said. "Come sit. We were just making plans." Raina moved into the room and sat by the fire again. "Who was that woman?" "A friend," Hannah said simply. "There are more white folks willing to help than you might think. Not many, but enough. Why would they risk it? Same reason we do. Because it's right. Because every person who makes it north is a crack in the foundation of this whole rotten system." Hannah poured something hot from a pot hanging over the fire and handed it to Raina. "Drink this. It's just broth, but it'll help." Raina sipped the broth, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "What's the swamp like?" "Wet, cold and full of things that bite," Josiah said. "But the patrollers won't follow you in there. They're too afraid of getting lost or worse. How long to get through it? Depends on how fast you move. Could be a day, could be 3. Raina nodded, absorbing the information. 2 days here, then into a swamp, then 20 miles to the next station. And after that, more miles, more stations, more risks. The path to freedom was longer and harder than she had imagined. But for the first time since she had put those shackles on Mrs. Caldwell's wrists, she felt something like hope. The next 2 days passed in a blur of eating, sleeping, and preparation. Hannah gave her proper clothes. A heavy wool dress, a thick shawl, and boots that actually fit. Josiah taught her how to read moss on trees to find north, how to listen for the sound of pursuit, how to move quietly through underbrush. The young man who had been there that first night, his name was Samuel, brought her a walking stick and a small pack with dried meat and cornmeal. On the morning of the 3rd day, before dawn had broken, Hannah woke her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's time," she said. Raina dressed quickly, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. She strapped the pack to her back and took the walking stick. Hannah handed her something else, a small piece of paper folded tight. "If you get caught, eat this," Hannah said. "It's got directions to the next station. Can't let them find it on you." Raina tucked the paper into her dress, feeling its weight like a promise. Outside, Josiah was waiting with Samuel. The sky was just beginning to lighten, stars fading into grey. They would have maybe an hour before full light. "Ready?" Josiah asked. Raina looked back at the cabin one last time, at Hannah standing in the doorway watching them. The older woman raised her hand in farewell, and Raina raised hers in return. Then she turned north and began walking toward whatever came next. The swamp opened before them, like the mouth of something ancient and hungry. Raina had never seen anything like it. Water the color of tea spreading between twisted cypress trees, their roots jutting up from the surface like gnarled fingers. Moss hung from branches in long trailing curtains that swayed in the faint morning breeze. The air smelled thick and rotten, like earth turned inside out. "Stay close," Josiah said, stepping onto what looked like solid ground but gave slightly under his weight. "Watch where I step. Some of this looks safe but isn't." Raina followed, placing her feet exactly where his had been. Samuel brought up the rear, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this before. The water rose around their ankles, cold and murky, seeping through Raina's boots. Within minutes her feet were soaked. They moved in silence, weaving between trees, stepping over submerged logs, ducking under low branches. The swamp was waking up around them. Birds called from hidden perches, their cries sharp and strange. Something splashed in the water nearby, and Raina's heart jumped, but Josiah didn't even turn his head. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in slanted beams that turned the water to gold. But the beauty was deceptive. Raina's legs burned from the constant effort of pulling her feet free from sucking mud. Her dress grew heavy with water and filth. Insects swarmed around her face, biting her neck and arms. By midday, they stopped on a small island of higher ground to rest and eat. Raina's hands shook as she pulled dried meat from her pack. Every muscle in her body screamed. "How much farther?" she asked. "We're maybe a third of the way through," Josiah said. chewing slowly. "The hard part comes later when the water gets deeper." "Deeper than this?" "Up to your chest in some places. But that's also where it's safest. The patrollers never go that deep." Raina looked out at the endless expanse of water and trees. She thought about turning back, about finding an easier route, but there was no easier route. There was only forward or capture. "I can do it," she said, more to herself than to them. Samuel smiled slightly. "I know you can. You wouldn't have made it this far if you couldn't." They rested for perhaps 20 minutes, then pushed on. The water did get deeper, rising past Raina's knees, then her thighs, then her waist. The cold was numbing, turning her legs to wooden stumps that barely responded to her commands. Her pack floated behind her, tethered to her waist with a piece of rope. The walking stick became essential, probing ahead for hidden drops or soft mud that could swallow her whole. Time lost meaning in the swamp. There was only the endless slog through water, the ache in her legs, the burn in her lungs. Josiah led them along paths only he could see, occasionally pausing to check the position of the sun or examine a particular tree. Once, they passed what looked like a small clearing on higher ground, and Raina saw the remains of a fire and some scattered bones. "Someone else came through here," she said. "Someone who didn't make it," Josiah replied quietly. "Keep moving." The sun began to sink, painting the water in shades of orange and red. Josiah found another island, larger than the first, and declared they would camp there for the night. Raina collapsed onto the damp ground, too exhausted to care about the moisture seeping through her clothes. Samuel gathered what dry wood he could find and built a small fire. They couldn't risk a large one that might be seen, but the little flames provided some warmth and light. Raina huddled close to it, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. "You did good today," Josiah said, handing her more dried meat. "Better than some I've guided through here." "Doesn't feel good," Raina muttered. "It never does. But you're still moving, still breathing, that's what matters." They ate in silence, the swamp alive with night sounds around them. Frogs sang in a deafening chorus. Something large moved through the water nearby, and Raina saw the gleam of eyes reflecting the firelight before they disappeared. "Alligator," Samuel said, following her gaze. "They won't bother us if we don't bother them." Raina wasn't sure she believed that, but she was too tired to argue. When they finally lay down to sleep, taking turns keeping watch, she fell into unconsciousness like a stone dropping into deep water. The second day in the swamp was worse than the first. Raina's body was already pushed past its limits, and now it was being asked to go further. Her legs cramped constantly. Blisters had formed on her feet where the wet boots rubbed. Her hands, gripping the walking stick, were raw and bleeding, but she kept moving. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell's face when those shackles had clicked shut. She thought about Bess and the other enslaved people still trapped at the plantation. She thought about her mother, lost somewhere in the horror of the Middle Passage, and she moved for her too. They were crossing a particularly deep section, water up to Raina's chest, when Samuel suddenly stopped. He held up a hand, signaling silence, and turned his head to listen. Raina heard it too. Voices, distant but unmistakable. Men's voices calling to each other. "Down!" Josiah hissed. They sank into the water until only their heads remained above the surface, pressing themselves against the thick trunk of a cypress tree. Raina's heart hammered so hard she was sure it would give them away. The cold water made it hard to breathe, hard to think. The voices grew louder. Through the trees, Raina caught glimpses of movement. Men on the higher ground at the edge of the swamp, 4 or 5 of them, with dogs straining at leashes. The dogs barked and whined, their noses to the ground. "They lost the scent at the water," one man said, his voice carrying clearly across the swamp. "Told you we should have waited for low tide." "There ain't no tide in a swamp, you idiot," another man replied. "But you're right about the scent. Could be anywhere now. Could be dead, could have drowned or got eaten by a gator. The rewards for her alive or dead. We find a body, we still get paid." Raina felt rage flare hot in her chest, momentarily overwhelming the fear. They were talking about her like she was already dead, like she was nothing but a bounty to collect. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them she was right here, alive and defiant. But Josiah's hand found hers under the water and squeezed hard, a silent reminder to stay still and silent. The men moved along the edge of the swamp, the dogs pulling them in different directions. One dog seemed particularly interested in a spot not far from where Raina and the others were hiding, and for a terrible moment she thought it had caught their scent. But then something, maybe a raccoon or an otter, burst from the underbrush, and the dogs went crazy, dragging their handlers away in pursuit. The voices faded. The splashing and crashing grew distant, Finally, there was only the normal sounds of the swamp again. "Stay down a bit longer," Josiah whispered. "Make sure they're really gone." They waited, water lapping at their chins until Josiah was satisfied. Then they rose slowly, water streaming from their clothes, and continued forward. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They all knew how close they had come. By the time they emerged from the swamp on the far side, it was late afternoon of the third day. Raina's legs nearly gave out when she felt solid ground beneath her feet, ground that didn't shift or sink. She wanted to collapse right there, to kiss the earth and never move again, but Josiah kept them going. "We're not safe yet," he said. "We need to reach the next station before dark." They walked through forest now, proper forest with firm ground and trees that didn't grow in water. Raina's waterlogged boots squelched with every step, and she left a trail of muddy footprints behind them. But she was out of the swamp. She had survived it. As the sun touched the horizon, they emerged from the trees into farmland. Fields stretched out around them, and in the distance, Raina could see a small farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but Josiah approached it with caution. He led them around to the back of the house, to a large barn. He knocked on the barn door in the same pattern he had used at Hannah's cabin. 3 times, then twice, then once. The door opened to reveal a white man with a thick beard and work-worn hands. He looked at them, took in their bedraggled appearance, and nodded once. "Come in," he said in a voice rough with a foreign accent Raina couldn't place. Quickly, they followed him into the barn. It smelled of hay and animals, and warmth radiated from the bodies of cows and horses in their stalls. The man led them to the back, moved aside several bales of hay, and revealed a trapdoor set into the floor. "Down there," he said. "My wife will bring food and dry clothes soon. You stay quiet, yes? We have neighbors who ask too many questions." Josiah climbed down first, then helped Raina descend a ladder into a small underground space lit by a single lantern. Samuel came last, and the man above closed the trapdoor, plunging them into dimness. The space was barely large enough for the 3 of them to sit comfortably, but it was dry and relatively warm. Blankets were folded in one corner, and there was a bucket of water with a ladle. "We made it," Samuel said, and there was wonder in his voice. Raina leaned back against the earthen wall and closed her eyes. They had made it. Through the swamp, past the patrollers, to this hidden room beneath a barn. She was alive. She was still free. About an hour later, the trap door opened, and a woman's face appeared, older, kind, with flour dusting her apron. She lowered down a basket containing bread, cheese, apples, and a clay jug of milk. Then she lowered another bundle, dry clothes. "Change and eat," she said in the same accent as her husband. "You rest tonight. Tomorrow we talk about next part of journey." The trapdoor closed again. Raina ate mechanically, her body demanding fuel, then changed into the dry dress. It was rough homespun, but it was clean, and it didn't smell like swamp water. She wrapped herself in a blanket and felt warmth finally beginning to return to her bones. "How many more stations?" she asked Josiah. "Depends on which route we take. Could be 5, could be 10. Each one gets you closer to the border." "How long?" "Weeks. Maybe a month if we hit trouble." He saw her expression. "I know it seems like forever, but you've already done the hardest part. The swamp breaks most people. You didn't break." Raina touched her wrists, feeling the scars beneath the fabric of her sleeves. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell, wondered if the woman still had marks where the shackles had been, wondered if she understood now what she had done to so many people. Probably not. People like Mrs. Caldwell never understood. They never had to. But Raina understood. She understood that freedom wasn't something given or granted. It was something taken, fought for, bled for. She understood that every mile north was a mile earned. She understood that she would carry the scars of slavery for the rest of her life, but those scars would be a reminder of what she had survived, not what had destroyed her. "Get some sleep," Josiah said, settling into his own blanket. "Tomorrow starts early." Raina lay down on the packed earth floor, the lantern flame casting shadows on the walls. Above her, she could hear the faint sounds of the barn, animals shifting, the creak of wood, the whisper of wind through cracks in the walls. Normal sounds, safe sounds. She closed her eyes and slept without dreams. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of movement and hiding. They traveled by night, guided by conductors who knew every back road and hidden trail. They hid in root cellars, in attics, in false-bottomed wagons covered with hay. They crossed rivers by ferry when they could bribe the ferryman, and by swimming when they couldn't. They walked until Raina's feet bled again, until she learned to ignore pain and exhaustion and fear. At each station there were new faces, black and white, free and enslaved, all working together in a conspiracy of compassion. Some were Quakers who believed slavery was sin. Some were formerly enslaved people who had made the journey themselves and now helped others. Some were simply people who believed in justice more than they feared the law. Raina learned their names and forgot them just as quickly. It was safer not to remember too much, not to know too many details. If she was caught, she couldn't betray what she didn't know, but she remembered their kindness. The woman who gave her socks hand-knitted from soft wool, the man who showed her how to bandage her blistered feet, the young girl, no more than 10, who slipped her a biscuit wrapped in cloth and whispered, "God bless you." Sometimes they encountered other runaways, a family of 4 trying to keep their children quiet, a man with whip scars across his back, a woman who cried silently in the dark. They rarely spoke to each other. There was too much pain in each person's story, too much weight. They moved like ghosts, parallel but separate, all heading toward the same distant promise of freedom. 3 weeks into the journey, they reached a town Josiah called a border town. "We're close now," he said. "One more state and you're free. Really free." That night, they hid in the cellar of a church while a worship service thundered above them. Raina could hear singing, the voices raised in hymns that spoke of deliverance and promised lands. She wondered if the people singing knew that beneath their feet, other people were living out those very stories. The border came not with fanfare, but with a quiet moment on a cold morning when frost covered the ground like scattered diamonds. Raina stood at the edge of a river, narrow enough to cross but wide enough to matter. Josiah pointed to the far bank. "That's Pennsylvania," he said. "That's freedom." Raina stared at the opposite shore. It looked exactly like the shore she stood on. Trees, rocks, mud. Nothing marked it as different, as special, as the place where her humanity would suddenly be recognized by law, yet everything was different. Everything mattered. "How do we cross?" she asked. "There's a ferry a mile downstream, but it's watched. Safer to wade across here. Water's not deep this time of year." Samuel had left them 2 days prior, needed at another station to guide a different group. It was just Raina and Josiah now, and the old man looked tired, the journey wearing on him in ways he tried to hide. They entered the water together. It was achingly cold, stealing Raina's breath, but she pushed forward. The current tugged at her legs, trying to sweep her downstream, but she leaned into her walking stick and forced each step. Halfway across, the water rose to her waist, and she felt the pull of it trying to take her under. "Keep going," Josiah called. "You're almost there." Almost. The word had defined her life for weeks now. Almost safe. Almost free. Almost human in the eyes of the law. Her foot found the rising riverbed on the far side, and she climbed up the muddy bank, water streaming from her clothes. Josiah followed, moving slower, his breathing labored. When he reached solid ground, he stopped and turned back to look at the river they had just crossed. "That's it," he said quietly. "You made it." Raina looked down at her feet, at the Pennsylvania mud coating her boots. She had crossed an invisible line, and on this side of it, she was no longer property. She was a person. The law said so, though the scars on her wrists and the memories in her head told a different story about what she had always been. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you start a new life. There's a settlement about 10 miles from here, free black folks who'll help you get on your feet. They'll find you work, a place to stay. You'll be safe there. Will you come with me?" Josiah shook his head. "My work is getting people across. There are more coming behind you, always more. I need to go back." The thought of him returning to the danger, to the swamps and the hiding places, and the constant threat of capture made Raina's chest tighten. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for what he had given her. "Don't thank me, just live. Live free and live well, that's thanks enough." He pulled a scrap of paper from his coat and handed it to her. "Directions to the settlement. Follow the road north, look for a white church with a red door. Ask for a woman named Esther. Tell her Josiah sent you." Raina took the paper, memorizing the simple directions before folding it carefully. Josiah watched her, his eyes knowing. "One more thing," he said. "What happened back at the Caldwell place, what you did to that woman, that's going to follow you. The story's already spreading. Some folks will admire you for it. Some will be afraid of you. Some will think you're dangerous." "I am dangerous," Raina said. "To anyone who tries to put chains on me again." Josiah smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Good. Don't ever forget that. Don't ever let anyone make you small again." He clasped her hand once, his grip firm and warm, then turned and walked back toward the river. Raina watched him wade across, watched him disappear into the trees on the far side, and then she was alone. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the enormity of it. She was free. She was alone. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Then she started walking north. The settlement was smaller than she expected. Maybe 20 houses clustered around a common area, with a church at one end and what looked like a schoolhouse at the other. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could hear the sound of children playing somewhere out of sight. It looked ordinary, peaceful, like places she had glimpsed from a distance, but never been allowed to enter. She found the church with the red door and knocked. A woman answered, tall and broad-shouldered, with grey threading through her black hair and eyes that assessed Raina in a single glance. "Yes," the woman said. "I'm looking for Esther. Josiah sent me." The woman's expression shifted, becoming warmer. "I'm Esther. Come in, child. You look half frozen." Inside, the church was simple but clean, with wooden pews and a small altar. A fire burned in a potbelly stove, and Raina moved toward it automatically, drawn by the heat. Esther watched her, taking in the mud-stained dress, the exhausted face, the way Raina held herself like someone ready to run at any moment. "When did you cross?" she asked. "This morning. You come far?" "Carolina." Esther's eyebrows rose. "That's a long journey. You must be strong." Raina didn't feel strong. She felt hollowed out, scraped raw, held together by nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to quit. But she nodded, because what else could she do? "Are you hungry?" Esther asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Come on then. My house is next door. We'll get some food in you, get you cleaned up, and then we'll talk about what comes next." Esther's house was small but warm, filled with the smell of cooking and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. She sat Raina at a table and placed a bowl of stew in front of her, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat. Raina ate slowly, trying to pace herself, but her body demanded more. While she ate, Esther moved around the kitchen, preparing tea, slicing bread, her movements efficient and practiced. "We get folks like you coming through regular," she said. "Some stay, some move on further north. There's work here if you want it. A woman named Ruth runs a laundry business, always needs help. And the Millers, white family but good people, they hire folks to work their farm, pay fair wages too." Wages. The word was strange on Raina's ears. She had worked her entire life and never been paid a cent. The idea of working and receiving money in return felt like a dream. "I can work," she said. "I can do anything." "I believe you." Esther poured tea into 2 cups and sat down across from Raina. "But first, you need rest. Real rest. You've been running for weeks, I'd guess. Your body needs time to recover." "I can't afford time." "Child, you're free now. You can afford whatever you need." Esther's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen too many folks come through here running so hard they forget how to stop. You stop now, you rest, you heal. The work will still be there when you're ready." Raina wanted to argue, but exhaustion pulled at her like a riptide. She finished her stew, drank her tea, and when Esther showed her to a small room with a real bed, a bed with a mattress and clean sheets and a quilt, she lay down and fell into sleep so deep it felt like dying. She woke to sunlight streaming through a window and the smell of bacon frying. For a moment she panicked, thinking she had overslept and would be punished, but then she remembered there was no overseer here, no Mrs. Caldwell, no one to punish her for anything. She was free. The realization hit her again, as fresh and startling as the first time. She sat up slowly, her body stiff but rested, and looked around the room. Her muddy dress had been replaced with a clean one, folded neatly on a chair. Someone, Esther probably, had come in while she slept and taken care of her. When she emerged into the kitchen, Esther smiled. "Afternoon," she said. "You slept 14 hours. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize for sleeping, you needed it." Esther gestured to the table. "Sit, eat, then we'll talk." Over breakfast, Esther explained how the settlement worked. Most of the residents were formerly enslaved people who had made the journey north and decided to stay. They pooled resources, looked out for each other, and created a community where black people could live without fear. It wasn't perfect. There was still prejudice, still danger from slave catchers who sometimes crossed the border illegally, but it was safer than anywhere Raina had ever been. "You'll need papers," Esther said. "Free papers saying you were born free or legally manumitted. We have a man who can make them for you. They won't stand up to serious scrutiny, but they'll help if you run into patrollers or bounty hunters." "How much does that cost?" "We don't charge for that. Everyone who comes through needs papers. We consider it part of helping folks start over." Raina felt something loosen in her chest. Kindness without price, help without strings attached. It was so foreign to her experience that she almost didn't trust it. Over the next few days, Raina began to settle into the rhythm of the settlement. Esther introduced her to other residents, and Raina heard stories similar to her own. Escapes in the dead of night, long journeys through dangerous territory, losses too painful to fully articulate. But she also heard stories of triumph, of people who had found spouses and built families, who had learned to read and write, who had started businesses or bought land. One woman, Mary, had been free for 10 years and now ran a small school for children. Teaching them to read is teaching them to be free in their minds, Mary said. That's something no one can ever take away. Another man, Thomas, worked as a blacksmith and showed Raina the shop he had built with his own hands. I used to work iron in chains, he said, running his hand over his anvil. Now I work it free, makes all the difference. Raina started working at Ruth's laundry, scrubbing and pressing clothes for white families in the nearby town. The work was hard, her hands constantly raw from lye soap and hot water, but at the end of each week Ruth pressed coins into her palm, real money, earned by her own labor, belonging to no one but herself. She rented a small room in a boarding house run by a widow named Alice. The room was barely bigger than a closet, but it was hers. She could lock the door. She could come and go as she pleased. She could lie in bed at night and know that no one owned her, no one could sell her, no one could put chains on her wrists without breaking the law. But freedom was more complicated than she had imagined. Some nights, she woke gasping from nightmares of dogs and patrollers and Mrs. Caldwell's cold blue eyes. Some days she flinched at sudden movements or loud voices, her body remembering violence before her mind could catch up. The scars on her wrists ached in cold weather, a constant reminder of where she had been, and there was the question of what to do with her rage. It still lived inside her, that white-hot fury that had driven her to put shackles on her mistress. But here, in this free settlement, there was no outlet for it, no one to fight, no immediate oppression to resist. The rage had nowhere to go, so it turned inward, eating at her in quiet moments. One evening, about 2 months after her arrival, Esther found her sitting alone outside the boarding house, staring at nothing. You look troubled, Esther said, settling onto the step beside her. I don't know how to be free, Raina admitted. I know how to survive, I know how to endure, but I don't know how to just live. Esther was quiet for a moment. None of us do at first. We spend so long learning to be small, to be invisible, to swallow our feelings and our words, and then suddenly we're supposed to be whole people, and we don't know how. Does it get easier? Some days. Some days it's still hard, but you build a life piece by piece. You find things that matter to you. You connect with people who understand. Esther paused. Have you thought about going back? Raina's head snapped up. Back where? Not back to slavery. Never that. But back to help others escape. Some folks who make it north, they can't rest until they've helped bring more people through. Conductors on the railroad like Josiah. Is that something that calls to you? Raina thought about the journey she had made, the terror and the exhaustion, and the moments when she had been certain she wouldn't survive. The thought of doing it again, of risking everything she had gained, should have horrified her, but instead she felt something stir in her chest. Purpose, maybe, or a way to channel the rage into something useful. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe someday, but not yet. I'm not ready. That's fair, you take your time. But when you are ready, if you are ready, we'll be here. Winter deepened, bringing snow that transformed the settlement into something from a painting. Raina bought herself a warm coat with money she had earned, and the simple act of choosing it herself, of handing over her own coins and walking out of the store with something that belonged to her, made her want to cry. She began attending the church services, not because she had found God, but because she liked the singing, the way voices joined together in harmony. She liked the community of it, the way people looked out for each other. She liked feeling like she belonged somewhere. And slowly, painfully, she began to heal. The nightmares came less frequently. The flinching at sudden movements gradually faded. She learned to accept kindness without suspicion, to trust that not everyone was trying to hurt her. She made friends, other women who had walked similar paths, who understood without needing explanation. One day in early spring, a new group of runaways arrived in the settlement, guided by Josiah. Raina saw them from a distance, a young man and 2 children, all of them exhausted and frightened, their eyes wide with the terror of the hunted. She walked over to where Esther was greeting them, offering food and shelter. The young man looked at Raina with haunted eyes, and she saw herself reflected there, the person she had been when she first crossed that river. You're safe now, she told him, and meant it. Later that evening, she found Josiah warming himself by the fire in Esther's kitchen. He looked older than when she had last seen him, more worn down. You keep coming back, she said. Someone has to. Don't you ever want to rest? He smiled tiredly. I'll rest when there's no one left to guide. Until then, this is my work. Raina sat beside him, staring into the flames. Tell me how, she said quietly. "Tell me how to be a conductor. I think I'm ready to start helping." Josiah looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her face that satisfied him. "It's dangerous work," he warned. "You could be caught. You could be killed or sold back into slavery." "I know. Then I'll teach you. But not tonight. Tonight, you rest. We both rest." As spring turned to summer, Raina learned the routes and the signals, the safe houses and the secret signs. She learned how to move silently through forests, how to read the stars, how to calm frightened runaways and keep them moving when they wanted to give up. She made her first journey as a conductor in June, guiding a family of 3 across the same swamp she had crossed months before. Standing on the Pennsylvania side of that river, watching the family she had brought to freedom climb the muddy bank, Raina felt something shift inside her. The rage was still there. It would always be there, a scar as permanent as the ones on her wrists, but it had transformed into something else, something stronger and more enduring than anger. It had become purpose. And if that's inspired you to see this journey through to the end, hit that like button, subscribe to make sure you catch every story we tell, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from right now. Years later, when people asked Raina about her life, she would tell them about the day she put shackles on her mistress. She would tell them about the swamp and the river and the moment she stepped onto free soil. But more than that, she would tell them about the dozens of people she guided to freedom, the lives she changed, the chains she helped break. She would tell them that freedom wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that she walked every day of her life. And she would show them her wrists, where the scars still marked her skin, and say, "These remind me where I've been, but they don't define where I'm going." The iron had marked her once. Now she used iron to mark the path to freedom for others. And in that transformation, she found not just survival, but life itself.